Good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Health and Places Initiative, an interdisciplinary group between Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and School of Public Health. The HAPI project, which is what we call it for short, investigates how to create healthier cities in the future with a specific emphasis on China. My name is Emily Salomon, and I'm a research associate here at the Graduate School of Design, and I'll be moderating today's session. The webinar that we're presenting, called Planning and Design Guidelines and Prototypes for Healthier Places, is the third in a series of 5 webinars that will feature research conducted by experts involved in the HAPI project. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website afterwards. A PDF file of the slides will also be posted online for you to view. But before we go any further, I want to quickly review some of the functionality of this webinar platform to maximize your viewing experience. Your active participation is important today. Right now, everyone is on mute to avoid background noises, but if you have any problems hearing us, please click on the audio icon, which is a green button located on the top left-hand side of your screen. You'll see a box on the right-hand side of your screen with the label Q&A. This is the question and answers pod. If you have any questions during the presentations, please type your question into the lower box within this pod. When it's submitted, it will go directly to the speakers and we will be monitoring them as the questions come in, and only we can see the questions that you ask. Following the presentations during our question and answer segment, we'll have the opportunity to read your questions out loud and have the speakers respond to them. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible during that segment. And throughout the presentation, you also have access to the chat functionality on the top right-hand side of your screen. And you can use this pod to let us know if you have any technical difficulties or want to get in touch with us during the webinar. But before we get started and I hand over the mic, I'd like to quickly introduce you to our speakers who all work at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. You can read their full biographies on our website, and I encourage you to do so. Our first speaker, Dr. Ann Forsyth, is a professor of urban planning and a principal investigator of the Health and Places Initiative. Leary Asensio is a registered architect and lecturer in architecture and landscape architecture at the Harvard GSD. Together with David Ma, who's another speaker you'll be hearing from today, she founded Asensio Ma, a multidisciplinary design collaborative active in the design, architecture, landscape design, and master planning fields. David Ma is a lecturer in landscape architecture at Harvard's Grad School of Design, and he's been collaborating with Leary Asensio as Asensio Ma since 2002. And last but not least is Laura Smead, a research associate in urban planning for the Health and Places Initiative. With master's degrees in both urban planning and psychology, Laura has specialized knowledge on health, aging, climate change, and sustainable urban planning. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over the mic to Dr. Ann Forsyth.
Thanks, Emily. The Health and Places Initiative brings together people from Harvard's design and public health schools to create an evidence-based approach to making healthy places. We have a particular focus at the scale of the neighborhood or town down to the block. And as you can see from the diagram of the project, it has a lot of components in the areas of research, education, tools, guidelines, publications, and events. But today we're focusing in on the area in dark blue, where we're creating prototypes aimed at designers and guidelines aimed at planners and civic leaders. In order to create these prototypes and guidelines, we started by reviewing the literature on a variety of topics connecting health and place. We then wrote a series of accessible summaries we call research briefs. During the first 6 months of the project, our team reviewed hundreds of studies on the topics you see here on this slide, and then synthesized this information into the research summaries that are available now online. As you can see here, these focus on environmental exposures like air and water pollution, how places can help people connect to the resources they need for healthy living, how they can support healthy behaviours like healthy eating, and key concerns of vulnerable groups, particularly older people. Our perspective is that environments are just part of the picture in creating individual health. People's biology and behaviours matter, as do larger social, educational, policy and economic contexts. But place does make some difference, and we've been investigating what kind of difference it makes. After doing the review, we developed a suite of health impact assessment tools that are the subject of a later webinar. But they're important to the guidelines and prototypes in that they helped us identify key indicators of healthy places that we're using in both projects. The prototypes and guidelines draw on the research briefs and health assessments, but they've also gained tremendously from work by a team including Professor Peter Rowe, where we've been looking at the health in existing ordinary neighbourhoods in China, as well as from a broader survey of healthy places globally we've been conducting as a team. While the research briefs and the health assessments are completed, and you can find them on our website, the prototypes and guidelines are a work in progress and in fact won't be available for some time. So this webinar is a preview of work to come. In the rest of the webinar, we'll first hear from David Marr and Larry Asensio on the prototypes work, and then we'll come back to Laura Smead and myself to talk about the guidelines.
Thank you, Anne and Emily. So the relationship between public health concerns and the built environment has had a long history. Most significantly, the last major convergence between these two areas of concern was in the late 18th to 19th century, where industrialization and the rapid urbanization of the West brought issues of the rapidly changing nature of the built environment in focus relative to the concerns for the collective health of its populations. With the current rapid urbanization of many parts of the developing world, perhaps exemplified by the urbanization of China, we can see a return to the concerns of the built environment and how it may contribute to or have a negative effect on the public health of a rapidly growing urban population. Conversely, it is also interesting to consider the effect that this relationship between the two fields has had on the design disciplines. Looking back towards the period of the West's industrialization and urbanization, it is fair to argue that the concerns for public health and hygiene movement contributed to the birth of modern planning. It has been the trigger and motivation for many large-scale urban interventions that have contributed to the definition of the city, an example being the construction of the embankment along the River Thames in London. The construction of the embankment offered a new significant public realm for the city, while being the manner through which a modern sewer system was installed for the city. The birth of a general theory of urbanization developed by Ildefonso Cerdà for the 19th century extension of Barcelona was largely motivated by the hygiene movement and a desire to open up the city as a direct reaction to the old perceived congested and unsanitary nature of the medieval core of the city. The adoption of a highly systematic approach to urbanization is reflected in the elaboration of the mathematical formulas and systems for defining the physical fabric of the city, where the definition of the urban block and grid system is informed by quantifiable parameters related to, amongst others, the access to sunlight and green open space through the appropriate balance between built volume and open spaces. It has been discussed that the role that Frederick Law Olmsted played as a public health official prior to the delivery of Manhattan's Central Park had an influence over his understanding of public spaces and the role in enabling and accommodating recreation and physical activity for the urban population. It was also his ambition that such spaces will play an important role in contributing to the social and physical health of its population. In the development of modern architecture, the influence of health and the accommodation as well as the expression of hygiene is widely acknowledged. Exemplary projects and many of the tropes of modern architecture were informed by particular responses towards health and hygiene concerns. Richard Neutra's Lovell House to Le Corbusier's 5 Points have been influenced by concerns for accommodating what was perceived to have been a healthy way of life. And it is through this adoption of imagined and actual subjects or lifestyles that architects and other designers of the built environment have adopted for their designs that we may be able to see how the design disciplines can be influenced by contemporary public health issues. A significant shift in focus for public health in many developed countries has been a rising concern for addressing chronic diseases, in opposition to an earlier focus on addressing acute conditions. The face of disease in the 18th and 19th centuries can be exemplified by the Blue Death of cholera, whereas much of contemporary concerns of chronic diseases focus on lifestyle issues such as the obesity epidemic. It is also worth considering the changing demographics of much of the global population, where there has been a significant shift towards a graying population. More specifically, in China, where there is already a high percentage of elderly people, the subjects that inform the design processes suggest the need for a more inclusive built environment. If the ideal subject for modern architecture was often the health athletic young citizen, seen here in Le Corbusier's depiction of the boxer in his Algiers project, today's subject may in fact look quite different. In China, the added complication of the effects of the one-child policy, where the 4-to-1 phenomena contributes to a perceived imbalance in the demographics, suggests the need to rethink how the built environment may allow for a more varied set of living arrangements, ranging from single living to extended families, and the ways in which aging in place may be enabled in contemporary Chinese neighborhoods. A concern for the health of the environment and its effect on the health of its populations. In the 19th century, the environment had been seen to be the medium and often the culprit for many of the ills of the time. Miasma theory preceded the knowledge of the role of bacteria and viruses in the spread of illnesses and was instrumental in the misguided focus of the built environment as a public health concern. This led to a series of ill-informed strategies, such as the widespread paving of the city's streetscapes in order to prevent the emergence of miasma from the ground. However, in contemporary China, it would be fair to conclude that the rapid urbanization and industrialization of the country has had an impact on the environment. The heavy investment in industry and the practice of models of urbanization that prioritize automobile transport has contributed to the increase in environmental pollution. The effects of this elevated level of pollution on human health has been well documented, and it can be argued that the definition of models of urbanization and neighborhoods that enable various practices may contribute towards addressing the treatment of the city's air, water, and soil, improving the environment in order to affect human health. And now I'll pass it over to David Ma.
So, in the HAPI group, In the HAPI group, we have focused on the development of a series of prototypes for China's neighborhoods that address and integrate concerns and strategies related to addressing public health through the design of the built environment. Through a careful application of parameters from the health impact assessment, we developed proposals for the configuration of a typical Chinese superblock, which measures approximately 400 meters by 400 meters. Through both work developed by our research group and in parallel through an advanced graduate level option studio course. In the work of the research group, the focus has been on the systematic application and study of the health impact assessment parameters to 3 typical block development types that were identified in the site of study, Songjiang, a city located on the periphery of Shanghai. The testing of these health impact assessment parameters on these 3 blocks and their augmentation through design also provided a mediating process where we could actually see the effect that the built environment might have on these health issues. The 3 block types were studied and adjusted to study the effects of slight organizational modifications or transformations on their performance relative to a number of health-related measures. These include the study of walkability related to the the number of openings that may be introduced into what is a typically large superblock circumscribed by fences. We also studied the effect of accessibility to amenities and the effect that the location of amenities may have on the general accessibility that the blocks have to these functions are important for a number of reasons. One of them is obviously when considering the growth of the elderly population, we have to consider that the life space of the elderly has a greatly reduced perimeter. So the walkability and access to these amenities in a very direct manner are important. Oops. We also studied the possibility of strategically locating these amenities in the middle of groups of blocks rather than within the blocks themselves. These were also informed by ideas of actually allowing for the possibility of links or bridges across the neighborhoods, these amenities to act as links and bridges. We studied the kind of open space pattern within these blocks in relative to thermal comfort and solar and shading analysis in order to actually gain some sort of quantitative analysis of the kind of quality and comfort level that would actually be fostered within these spaces. The proportion, configuration, and location of open and green spaces and recreational spaces within the blocks were also studied. Then the possibility of converting a lot of these open spaces into actually performative, functioning landscapes or open spaces that actually deal with issues such as treatment of water and runoff were also investigated as possibilities. Oops, I'm going to go back. I think we're missing a slide. And we studied the possibility of subdividing the block to increase the street grain and decrease the scale of these blocks in order to allow for the possibility of a more redundant but at the same time smaller and more pedestrian and cycle-friendly streets. Through these analyses and simple modification to the block structure, utilizing computational modeling tools such as associative modeling, we were able to generate a wide range of iterations. Go back. Sorry. Yeah, here we go. That's fine. We were able to generate a wide range of iterations of different block organizations while simultaneously being able to evaluate their performance relative to health concerns. This offers a design tool where the design process may allow for the development of neighborhood block types with an integrated relationship to their evaluation relative to health parameters and indicators. So in parallel to these series of analyses and studies that we've been doing in the research group, we've also conducted research into developing prototypes for urban blocks in China through an upper-level graduate option studio here conducted at the Graduate School of Design. A series of more speculative design approaches could be pursued in this context, where more qualitative concerns could be investigated to complement the more quantitative approach pursued within the research group. Students developed their own responses to the 400 by 400 superblock through the lens of public health, choosing to focus on a series of specific topics, projects ranging from the development of blocks to enable the possibility of greater social capital and multi-stranded links, the study of blocks that better facilitate the possibility of a more inclusive range of lifestyles, allowing for the possibility of aging in place scenarios, block types developed around parameters for physical activity, and blocks that work towards a more explicit integration of new health policies from the state, to blocks that works towards leveraging techniques for improving the health of the environment to enrich the lifestyle of its residents. All of these speculations clearly framed by an understanding and a critical eye towards the current urban block structure that inherits patterns from the older downway models of large urban superblocks and Soviet-style road systems. Urban design, planning, landscape, and architectural concerns were all studied in depth in order to understand the manner in which concerns for enabling and facilitating the possibility of healthy lifestyles may be both accommodated and expressed through the modification of parts of the current practices of block development. The ambitions were to offer models for the block as neighborhood rather than impose new lifestyles, offering the possibility of enriching and enabling life practices that students studied from existing and older precedents from China that may typically be restricted by current models of development. Okay. And I'll pass it back to Anne.
Sorry.
Laura, sorry.
Thanks so much, David and Larry. You can see that health can be a really important spur to new design thinking at the scale of a block. And another part of the project has been looking at the neighbourhood and town with a slightly different audience, planners and civic leaders. What can these groups do to make healthier places? Now, obviously, health is a topic that interests us personally in a way that few other issues do. And while it can be seen narrowly as an absence of disease, for many it's much broader, about physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being. And of course, in this, it transcends place. It is about much, much more. But places certainly can have a role in supporting healthy lives. As we thought about guidelines for planners and civic leaders, one approach would be to just translate research on exposures, connections, the way environments can support behavior, and the needs of diverse groups into guidelines. But we want to make this volume do more. So in addition to translation, we've been working hard to develop a broader conceptual framework of health or well-being so we can fill in where there are necessarily gaps in research. And Laura's going to explain a little bit more about a preliminary version of this.
Thanks, Anne. You've seen this slide before, and that's because it really was an important first step for a number of parts of this project, and that was to review the state of the research and how health and place are connected. Drawing on this research, there were several concluding ideas that are helping to inform our guidelines project. First is that health provides a useful lens for investigating urban design and planning issues, and also provides a catalyst for imagining better places. Some aspects of health and place, the health and place relationship are easier to quantify, and some are more qualitative. So for example, some of the built environment topics such as air quality, toxics, or water quality are much easier to quantify consistently than social capital, for example, which has been defined and measured in many different ways in the literature. Similarly, there are many aspects of health that are somewhat universal, particularly the more physical reactions to exposures to toxics or pollution, and others are intertwined with personal behaviors, social networks, your economic situation or culture. For instance, things like food consumption, mental health, social capital, or physical activity. Finally, as David and Liari discussed in their introduction, the issue of aging and the aging population this issue is really large and unprecedented. So key focus for the future should be healthy design for longevity. So now I'll turn it back over to Anne to discuss the guidelines for healthy places work.
Thanks, Laura. The areas of research on exposures, connections, and so forth are important. But in structuring the book, we wanted to go beyond the categories of the research summaries to look at the process of making places. So we've created a network type structure for thinking about the guidelines. At the top level, the guidelines are organized around 8 stages in a planning and design process that I'll explain a bit more later. We then propose 14 or 15 big ideas, like needing to consider those with the most health vulnerabilities and the fewer resources. And finally make about 60 propositions about how to make healthier places and numerous specific actions. These are the stages. The 4 in gray represent generally good planning. For example, number 2 is about understanding how change occurs, something that's very important in creating healthy places, but is important in many parts of planning. And it more specifically argues that big changes need to use many strategies all at once, both in planning, policy, programming, and the like. It also argues that it's key to critically assess the knowledge base of decisions and use both local knowledge and technical expertise. And finally, it argues for the importance of careful trade-offs. It's hard to make a place that is healthy in every dimension, and so figuring out which are the important dimensions is important. The 4 stages in blue are more the result of clear evidence about human health effects in the relatively short term. For example, enabling access to resources to lead a healthy life is really crucial. And this includes options for getting around, healthy designs of paths and streets, and designs creating places or other means to connect to other people. This is particularly important for the vulnerable groups in the next step, helping the young, the old, those with pre-existing disabilities, and the disenfranchised all live in supportive places and move around the environment. So overall, these guidelines are focusing as much on process of getting healthy places built as the content, with a key aim to get things implemented. And they combine physical place-based solutions with ideas for supporting programs and policies. Now, with all this potential detail, we could really get bogged down in explaining some of the hundreds of actions we propose. But instead, we thought we'd show you the kinds of thinking by interpreting the strengths and weaknesses of 2 real places. And for that, I'll hand you over to Laura.
Okay, thanks, Anne. So here's the first of 2 places we'll be looking at today, which is an urban park in Japan. We can see, a pond of some sort and walking trees and so on. So first I'd like to talk about what seems to be done well for health, and then I'll talk about some things that are perhaps not so good. Let me turn on my little arrow here so I can help point to things here. So the first thing that I notice is that this is really a public space, a shared space that provides opportunities for socializing and relaxing physical activity. You can see many forms of transportation in the space. There's cars over here, there's a scooter, bicycles and walking and so on. And all these mixing together sort of keeps the speed slow. But there could potentially be safety issues as well. So it's not totally clear how connected this community is to other resources, but I'm guessing that because you can see some of these larger buildings in the background, that it probably is fairly well connected. It also looks friendly for people of all mobility levels. You can see, someone in a wheelchair here and a stroller. You also have street trees, which provides a nice, sort of view of green. Which has been consistently shown to have some positive health benefits to lowering stress and emotional well-being and so on. Let's see, there's also some nice street lighting along here that helps to improve safety as well. Anything you would like to add?
No, but it seems that it's functioning very well as a shared space.
Mm-hmm. So some of the potential problems I would notice is if you look at this water feature in the middle, it's a little bit of an off color there. It may be that it's polluted, unusable. The banks of the pond here are they're not vegetative. It's a hard edge, and it looks pretty full. So it probably wouldn't serve very well as flood mitigation, for instance. And while street trees may be, and views of green are very good for mental health benefits, depending on the species, pollen can irritate allergies and so on. And while vegetation is good for, say, clearing carbon emissions and things, in general, it's very limited in its ability to actually clean air pollutants that have an impact on public health. So other greater measures are needed for that. I also see that there are some benches that exist along the edge here, and some people sitting on the railing, but there probably could be some more pedestrian amenities there, and things like public toilets and so on are very helpful, especially for an aging population. And also sharing the road can create some issues, especially with the scooters there, so there may be some safety concerns. Anything else to add before we move on?
Oh, just to say that this is a fairly well-functioning space, and so there must be some education and enforcement happening to resolve conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians. And if this kind of non-physical context wasn't there, the space might not work as well.
All right, so let's move on to our next place we're looking at here, which is, it's a mixed-use neighborhood in Korea in this case. So what seems good in this space? Well, because it's mixed use, that means that it provides options for accessing community resources and physical activity and socializing. You can see people walking together in groups. It also looks flat and pedestrian friendly. You can see someone in a wheelchair here. It also is connected to transit. There's a bus over there, someone probably waiting for the bus. And Although, so problematic aspects would be not a lot of lighting. I see maybe some lighting over here, but there's really no lighting in the open plaza area. There's lots of pavement here, so not so good for water quality or urban heat island effects. On that note, it really could use some more shading. There's a pretty skimpy number of trees happening there. It's probably quite hot in the summer. And then, of course, there are things we can't tell from the picture. So even though it's a mixed-use community, what we don't know is what the quality of those amenities are, what the resources are, if there is access to health care. We don't know the levels of crime or poverty and some of these other sources that could be for toxics or noise. So those are all potential issues that are just hard to tell from a picture. Anything else you want to talk about? All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So that's a preview of the prototypes and the guidelines that are underway. In the interim, we welcome you to look at our website and the materials already online, particularly the research briefs and the health assessment tools. So now I'll hand it back over to Emily.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for those presentations. I thought that was really informative and some really beautiful graphics that we were able to share with everyone. So thank you. We now have plenty of time for question and answers. If you haven't had an opportunity to ask your question to our speakers, please feel free to do so by typing it in the lower right-hand side of your screen in the Q&A pod. We do have a couple questions, but feel free to type them in the next few minutes. All right, so the first question I have is actually for David and Leary related to the studio project that you had mentioned. My question for you is, were there any new ideas or surprising findings generated from the students' projects and models that made you think differently about design and health?
Right, so, I mean, in principle, because the design studio was meant to find ways in which we could actually visualize and actualize a lot of these health impact assessment parameters in a physical design. One way that it was surprising is that actually the fact of simply visualizing the consequences of the application of these health parameters were in many cases quite novel. A lot of the typological actualization of architectural landscape or urban responses to these parameters were actually quite novel. We found some interesting novelty out of that. The other interesting aspect from the studio was that depending on the parameter, it also meant that it would either be more effective to allow for more choices and variety. So for instance, some students who were looking at the issue of social capital and diversity, basically fostering a more diverse population within the block, found it was more important to allow for more choice and more variety in the built environment. Whereas in some other cases, if you were to apply physical activity parameters, it also suggested that it may have been better to do what architecture does best, which is limit choices. So that's another interesting thing. And finally, probably more related to the research group, one of the interesting findings we found is sometimes simple small transformations and the types of transformations had more significant effects. So for example, in the walkability studies, we found that it wasn't really the number of entrances that we put into the gated community, but it was actually more the strategic location of them that had a much bigger effect on the walkability. So rather than having a lot of openings in a very ineffective configuration, it was much more effective to have lesser openings, but in a more effective configuration.
Excellent. Thank you.
You know, I actually have a perspective as an outsider on the studio that what was nice about what the students did was how provocative they could be with their designs. For instance, one design forced people to undertake a very circuitous route to get to their home. Now, this would actually not be possible in the real world because folks would find a way to get around this circuitous route. However, it does actually tap into a key insight in kind of research on physical activity, that you actually have to make the environment a bit inconvenient in order to promote physical activity. And so it just showed that in an extreme and very provocative way, and in that way I thought was very, very useful.
Great. Thanks for that response. Couple other questions, more related to the publications that you described and that are forthcoming. The question is, what are the key messages that you hope practitioners will take away from these books, both the design guide, the guidelines, and the planning guidelines and the design prototypes?
Well, one of the first things is that for the design, at least the book and the prototypes will be aimed quite a lot at the design. Let's call them more of a lay design audience. So the exposure and I guess even the awareness of the impact that public health has had on the history of the design disciplines is maybe a little bit less known than it typically should be. And also the potential, let's say the future issues that have to be tackled in public health will also have a significant effect on design. So we're trying to present, in this case, let's say the issues that that should be considered and some of the possible responses.
So in that sense, you mentioned you asked about what is the audience. So we are very much targeting it to designers to get them much more involved in public health. But it's also probably, as Anne was mentioning before, it can be rather provocative and interesting for planners as well to browse through it. But the main target is designers, basically. And yeah.
And so for the guidelines, we are really aiming at more at planners and a sort of lay civic leaders sort of audience, people who are interested in making changes to their local environments. And we hope what is new about it is that it is both evidence-based, where there is evidence, but also reflective, systematic, and thoughtful in the areas where there isn't evidence. There just can't be research on every relation between health and place, in part because there are so many dimensions where health and place are interconnected, the exposures, the behavior support, the connections, but also because places vary so much. So it's important to have a very good conceptual framework for filling in those gaps. And it's also important to be clear where there is evidence and where we are filling it in with our best judgment, and hopefully we'll do that. Laura, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that it's really trying to be very international in focus and also not have a particular agenda or style of planning that's gone into it. It's really about sort of showing where the research has led us and being clear about where there are and are not sort of clear evidence.
Yeah, so in that, I think by this, Laura means that a new urbanist could pick it up, but a modernist could pick it up, and they would both find something in it.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And another question, sort of, it builds off of the responses that you've given us so far, but the presentations that you've shared show the multiple intersections between health and the built environment. And so what are some of the areas where designers and planners can have the most impact on the ground in terms of influencing health?
Well, I'll try and start it. Some of them are, it varies a lot, but some of them are kind of easy and very direct. So the area that we called exposures, things like air quality, water quality, noise, and so on, are sort of effects of environmental sort of contexts on health that are very direct and where there isn't a lot of psychology involved. Different people are sensitive, more or less sensitive to things like noise and air quality, but it has a very direct physical kind of response from people. And so if you get rid of those problems, you'll have a direct physical effect. Things like connections to other people, to resources, to live a healthy life, are a little more indirect because people have to take advantage of those connections. And the research is also quite complicated. For instance, different kinds of environments seem to foster different forms of social connectedness. And the relationship between those different forms of social connectedness, like trust or political activity, may lead to different kinds of health outcomes. So it's a very complicated situation. And in those situations, the environment is only part of the picture in fostering connections, because connections are made in other ways as just person to person, and they can be reinforced by communications technologies and so on. And then finally, the behavior supports, things like having environments that can support physical activity or healthy eating or behaving safely. Those rely on people wanting to take advantage of them. And they also vary by scale. We have a very vibrant discussion in our team about the effects of environments on healthy eating. And I actually think the environment at a very big scale, like the media environment, in a very small scale, like the plate and the food display, matters somewhat more than the neighborhood level. But we have a very vibrant discussion amongst our team. But that's to say that environments, when the environment is very complex, the environmental scale that we're looking at is the neighborhood and block. And in that area, some things like exposures are easier to quantify. They have a simpler relation to health than some of the other things.
Yeah, and also thinking sort of the short term, like exposures. You might imagine you want to have some zoning and some buffering and things like that of these toxic sources and not put them in next to vulnerable people. But at the same time, you want to also allow this sort of mixed use type format, urban, more compact, connected kind of urban form can help to put more greater proximity and things between these resources.
So that's a trade-off between buffering people from air pollution and helping them be connected. And then there's the short term and the long term. One of the parts of the guidelines is about helping protect the environment in the long term, things like climate change and so on. And many of the strategies put in place won't actually affect health in the short term very much, but they're good for the long term or the wider society. So it is a very complicated question.
Yes, but a very thoughtful answer. Thank you. And from the design perspective, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, maybe more in terms of the design practice. I think one of the things that one of the valuable lessons we had from coming away from working within this group is that it's obviously a multidisciplinary group. And all of these public health issues actually have multiple levels at which they are affected by different factors. So I would imagine that being aware that having a multidisciplinary approach or understanding of the problem is actually very important. And actually, in one sense, policy is not the only thing that will affect it, but in the other sense, built environment is not also the only thing that will affect. So being aware of these multiple factors that affect the effect of public health. And even within the design profession, we have within the GSD an architectural landscape and an urban planning department. Being able to understand that those three, and trying to have some sort of understanding across those three areas is important as well.
And in fact, maybe it's worth mentioning that the Option Studio became a very good crossover across departments. We had students from urban design, landscape architecture, and architecture, and it was very interesting to see them work in these multidisciplinary teams. Maybe I will just add one little thing. During the studio and also in the research lab, something that we are heavily invested is also in the kind of definition of the public ground, basically, and how one also we address very lightly the landscape component in all this. And Laura, you were mentioning about air quality and whatnot, and water quality. We are also looking into this kind of finer grain of the public space, how we could help, at least, if not fully mitigate, help in creating a better environment in that sense. So it's something that we are quite invested as well.
Great.
And one last question for you. Again, we do have, if you haven't typed in a question, please feel free. But one other question that we have pending is about the limitations of the research. And if you could describe a little bit about some of the challenges that maybe you've run into.
Well, one challenge that I think Laura also spoke to was the fact that there isn't research on every relevant topic, and in fact there never can be, because there are just so many different kinds of environments, and also people respond differently to different kinds of environments. So that means that in some areas we need to extrapolate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another limitation would be to say that, again, there's always these trade-offs, right? So you can imagine some things that might be good for the environment. There's always tensions, right, between trade-offs between a compact, connected community that could increase noise and air pollution or something like that, and also not wanting to have, things so spread out that you're entirely dependent on a car, like you need some sort of transit and so on. So it gets complicated pretty quickly.
From the design point of view, we've had this conversation. From the design point of view, we've had this conversation many times about the quantitative and the qualitative. So that's always a kind of difficult area because there are a lot of parameters that are easily quantifiable, and the HIAs have been fantastic in helping us basically have that background data that then we are developing all these techniques to be able to kind of apply to design directly. But there are a lot of other areas that are not quantifiable, and we're having to find ways to evaluate that qualitative side of things. And for me, that's the kind of, if you wish, one of the huge challenges. I mean, how to evaluate this qualitative.
And actually, just to be clear about the health assessment, they're actually not all quantitative either. We have one that's a workshop format to take account of this issue, that there are some things that just can't be quantified in this area.
Mm-hmm.
I guess ultimately with design, the final test of everything is when it's actually built and out in the world. So that's one of the limits.
Yes, the kind of post-occupancy evaluation. But yeah.
Although actually for that, the component of work that's being done by Peter Rowe and his team, which includes many of us as well, and there won't be a webinar on this, is evaluating 25 existing neighborhoods in China. So in that way, we're looking a little bit at the health performance of sort of existing neighborhoods built in the last 30 years, the kinds of environments that have proliferated across China, and that will be the subject of retrofitting and renovation in years to come.
Great. Well, that's a good segue to talk about some of the upcoming webinars. We have 2 more webinars in this series, one next week and one the following week. They are, the one next week is on energy efficient and healthy housing with a focus on China, and that's going to be presented by someone at the School of Public Health. And then following that will be a webinar on the health assessment tools, which you heard a little bit about today, which have informed some of the design prototypes, and will be exclusively focused on that topic. So I encourage you to check out our website, learn a little bit more about those events, put them on your calendar. And if you can't attend live, those presentations will also be recorded and made available for you to view afterwards. So I want to thank all of you who attended this webinar today. As mentioned earlier, the recording will be made available online, and we'll get that up on the website this afternoon. And I would love to thank our wonderful speakers once again for preparing these slides and presenting them with us today. It was really informative, and I appreciate your thoughtful responses to the questions. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks.